What happens when a man's strength finally runs out? What is left when the last pillar of our self-sufficiency crumbles and we are left on the threshold of existence, alone with the echo of our own emptiness? In that moment of absolute silence, where intellect, wealth, and cunning no longer serve as a shield, only one gesture remains: the desperate embrace of something or someone infinitely greater. This is the story of an encounter that happens precisely at this breaking point, on the border between the end of man and the beginning of God, a narrative that invites us to explore the terrible and transformative beauty of surrender, showing that it is on the ground of our weakness that heaven descends to touch us, to remake us, to give us a new name and a new destiny. On a night that seems to have been torn from eternity itself, a man found himself trapped between the past that haunted him and the future that terrified him. The place was a valley cut by the soft sound of a stream called Jabbok, a name that would echo forever in the corridors of redemption's history. There, in the solitude of the darkness, the story of a family, and indeed of an entire nation, would be rewritten. This was not a setting of peace, but a divinely prepared arena. Every shadow that danced with the wind, every nocturnal sound, seemed to amplify the tension of a soul in conflict, awaiting a confrontation that was both inevitable and entirely unexpected. The atmosphere was charged with the weight of a celestial decision. The man was Jacob, a name that in itself carried the weight of his identity. The deceiver, the supplanter, the one who lives by the strength of his own arm and the agility of his mind. Throughout his life, he had fought and won on his own terms, using cunning as his sword and shrewdness as his shield. But on that night, he was not fleeing from his brother Esau, whom he had deceived, nor from his father-in-law Laban, whom he had outsmarted. He was fleeing from himself, from the man he had become. And in the valley of decision, he would discover that the greatest adversary he would ever face would not be a man of flesh and blood, but a power that he could in no way deceive or manipulate. For in the dense darkness of Jabbok, Jacob was not alone. A figure emerged from the veil of night, a being whose presence was as overwhelming as it was silent. There was no exchange of words, only the beginning of an immediate, visceral, and relentless struggle. Who was this mysterious adversary who possessed superhuman strength, capable of wrestling with a vigorous man until the break of day? Was it an avenging angel sent to punish him for his sins? Was it a demon, a manifestation of his deepest guilt? The question that hung in that dark night was the same one that echoes in our own nights of anguish. Are we fighting against a force that has come to destroy us or to deliver us? The truth, however, was far more profound and paradoxical. That celestial being was not an enforcer of judgment, but an agent of transformation with a secret mission, a purpose sealed before the foundation of the world. His task was not to crush the patriarch, but to expose the fragility of his strength. He came not to defeat Jacob, but to defeat the Jacob that existed within him. He was a divine sculptor sent to break the shell of human self-confidence and reveal the core of a new man, a new identity. The struggle was, in fact, an act of creation, a spiritual surgery performed in the darkest of nights so that a new light could dawn. In this sacred arena, every move was a lesson. Every drop of Jacob's sweat was a liquid prayer, a confession of his stubbornness. The angel, for his part, did not use his full strength, but just enough to contain the man, to tire him, to bring him to the point of total exhaustion. That angel's mission was to lead Jacob to the end of himself. It was a violent and loving invitation for the deceiver to finally stop running and surrender to the power that confronted him. The one who had clung to heels and stolen blessings his whole life now needed to learn to cling solely to the one who had the power to truly bless, even if it meant being broken. This night of Jacob is a mirror for the dark night of the soul that each of us, at some point, is called to traverse. We all have a Jabbok on our path, a place of inevitable confrontation with God, where our masks fall away and our strength is revealed to be dust. In our own struggles, when we feel contended against by heaven, when it seems that God has become our adversary, Jacob's story invites us to ask a deeper question. What if the pressure we feel is not the hand of an enemy, but the embrace of a father, determined to free us from ourselves, to rid us of the false identities we have built? Therefore, the journey we begin now is not just the retelling of an ancient story, but an expedition into the heart of our own battles. The promise is to reveal that, in that valley of shadows, the angel's true mission was to forge a nation from a broken man. And by unveiling this mystery, we will discover together why, in our moments of greatest desperation, God is not attacking us, but rebaptizing us with a new name and a new purpose. Prepare yourself, for what happened that night has the power to redefine every struggle you have ever faced or will ever face, transforming the battlefield into an altar of worship. To understand the depth of what happened at Jabbok, we need to adjust our focus, lifting our gaze beyond the earthly valley. This was not merely a physical struggle between two beings, it was the earthly manifestation of a celestial drama. The stream of Jabbok, for one night, became the epicenter of a collision of realities, the visible stage for an invisible and monumental spiritual operation. We are talking about a confrontation whose audience was not composed of men, but of principalities and powers, of legions of angels watching in reverent silence. The Yid dust that rose from that ground was not just dirt, but the raw material from which a new covenant and a new nation would be formed under the watchful eye of the universe. This encounter was not by chance, an accident on Jacob's path. It was a divine appointment, scheduled on eternity's calendar before time began to be counted. Every step of Jacob's, from the deception in his youth to his flight and his fearful return, was a thread being woven into a grand tapestry, and Jabbok was the precise point of convergence. There, the sovereignty of God and the free will of a man would meet in a violent and sacred dance. That place became an altar in time, a moment when God's eternal plan intersected the timeline of humanity in a dramatic and irrevocable way, proving that there are no coincidences on the path of those who are called by Him. Let us imagine for a moment, beyond the veils of our reality, the heavenly scene from which this mission originated. Let's visualize the throne of grace, not as a seat of passivity, but as a cosmic command center, bathed in inaccessible light and surrounded by thundering majesty. It was from there, from the mind of the Father, that the order was issued, not with audible words, but with a decree of purpose, a movement of sovereign will that set the celestial agent in motion. The mission was clear and paradoxical. Descend to meet a flawed man, not to destroy him with absolute power, but to engage him in a struggle that would completely exhaust him, revealing a strength he did not know he possessed. The nature of this divine decree was a reflection of God's own heart, an act of severe and redemptive love. Heaven knew that the identity of Jacob, the deceiver, was a prison for the man. For Israel, the Prince of God, to be born, the old structure had to be demolished. The fight at Jabbok was, therefore, an intervention of mercy, disguised as a confrontation. It was the love that is not content with our mediocrity, the love that is willing to wound us in order to heal us, to break us in order to remake us in the image of His glory. That angel was not an adversary, but the surgical tool in the hand of the divine physician, performing an operation on the soul of a patriarch. While on earth the struggle seemed to be one-on-one, in the spiritual realm the implications were vast. That confrontation was a symbolic battlefield where the destiny of millions of souls was being weighed. Every time Jacob resisted, using his own strength, it was a momentary victory for the principle of human self-sufficiency. But every moment of exhaustion that brought him closer to surrender was a breakthrough for the divine plan of grace. The forces of darkness, which for years had exploited Jacob's flaws, watched, hoping he would give up or curse the power that oppressed him. But the heavenly armies awaited the moment when the man's weakness would finally give way to the sovereignty of God. The weight of that moment was incalculable. Within that, man wrestling in the dust, was contained the seed of the 12 tribes of Israel. In him rested the lineage from which, centuries later, the Messiah, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, would be born. If Jacob was not transformed, the nation that would carry God's name and promise would be born on a foundation of deceit and cunning. The integrity of God's redemptive plan for humanity required the patriarch to be rebaptized, not with water, but with fire and struggle. The destiny of a people chosen to be a light to the nations was being sealed, not in a palace or a temple, but in the solitude of a dark valley, through the surrender of a single man. And so, the valley of Jabbok transcended its geography. It ceased to be just a place on a map and became an eternal symbol, a portal between who we are and who we were called to be. The stream that Jacob needed to cross represented the final frontier between his old life and his new destiny. On one side of the stream was fear, the past of deceptions, the identity of Jacob. On the other side awaited reconciliation, blessing, the promise of a new identity as Israel. But to cross that border, he had to pass through the night of confrontation, through the struggle that would strip the traveler of everything he trusted in, except for God himself. This night of Jacob thus becomes the universal archetype of the dark night of the soul, an experience that in one way or another we are all called to face on our spiritual journey. It is that period in our lives when the lights go out, the answers disappear, and heaven seems to fall silent. It is the moment when we feel completely alone, fighting in the dark against circumstances, against our own doubts, and at times it feels as if we are fighting against God himself. It is our own crossing of the Jabbok, a personal and non-transferable confrontation that defines the course of our entire future. It is the night when the heavens feel like brass, and our prayers seem to hit the ceiling. It is when the presence of God, which was once our comfort, seems to have become an adversarial force that pressures us, corners us, and afflicts us. In this place of apparent divine abandonment, we are tempted to give up, to become resentful, or to seek a way out with our own strength. Jacob's story, however, offers us a new perspective, a heavenly lens through which to see this experience. It teaches us that this feeling of being fought by God may, in fact, be the clearest evidence that he is closer than ever, working in us on a level we cannot comprehend. What to Jacob seemed like a random attack in the darkness was, in celestial reality, a divine embrace, a choreographed dance to lead him to exhaustion and, finally, to dependence. The hand that wounded him was the same hand that held him. The power that oppressed him was the same power that kept him from fleeing his own blessing. This is the great paradox of faith. God meets us in our strength to reveal our weakness, and then, in our declared weakness, he fills us with his supernatural strength. The arena of our greatest conflict is often the place chosen by God to grant us our greatest revelation and our most profound transformation. If you have ever felt this lonely struggle with God, cornered between your past and your future, know that you are not alone. This journey through the valley of the shadow is part of the process of becoming who we were destined to be. Your dark night is not the end of your story. It is the prelude to your dawn, the stage for your own name change. If this message is already beginning to resonate with your soul, if you recognize the touch of the divine sculptor in your own struggles, leave a like so we know we are together on this journey of transformation, walking from our Jacob to our Israel. That dark valley, therefore, was transformed forever. It ceased to be a place of fear and became Peniel, the face of God. It became the divine anvil where an identity forged in cunning was hammered and reshaped by sovereign grace, becoming a vessel of honor. Jacob's struggle established an eternal principle. Before using us powerfully, God insists on marking us deeply. And to understand the nature of this mark and the power it contains, we must now dive into the sacred pages that recorded this cosmic event, allowing the very word of God to illuminate the details of this night that changed everything. Now let us dive into the sacred pages where this cosmic encounter was recorded with divine ink so that all generations could witness the anatomy of a transformation. The Word of God is not just a historical record, it is a living portal that allows us to enter the valley of Jabbok and feel the tension, the pain, and the glory of that night. It is here, in the text of Genesis chapter 32, that we find the original script of this monumental scene, an eyewitness account of God's power to remake a man from his very foundation. Let us allow Scripture to be our guide, our light in the darkness of this valley, revealing every crucial detail of this struggle for the soul of a nation. The narrative begins with an atmosphere of deliberate isolation. Verse 22 tells us that, on that night, Jacob arose and had his family and all that he owned cross the ford of Jabbok. He made sure everyone was safe on the other side, but he himself did not cross. Verse 24 is emphatic, and Jacob was left alone. This solitude was not accidental, it was essential. The transformation that was to come was so deep and personal that there could be no witnesses. It was a transaction between Jacob and his Creator, a soul business that required him to be stripped of all his possessions, all his relationships, and all his defenses. In this divinely orchestrated solitude, the confrontation begins. The text says that a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. The identity of this man is kept under a veil of mystery at first, a figure who emerges from the shadows without introduction. The fight is immediate, intense, and tireless. It is not a brief skirmish, but a battle that stretches for hours, consuming the entire darkness of the night. This duration is symbolic, representing the long and stubborn resistance of human nature against the divine will. Jacob, the lifelong wrestler, used every ounce of his strength, every trick he knew, in a desperate attempt to subdue his heavenly opponent. For hours, the fight seems to be a stalemate. Jacob's strength, the same strength that had allowed him to prosper and survive for decades, was being honored but also exhausted. The celestial being allowed Jacob to expend his entire arsenal of self-sufficiency. Then we arrive at verse 25, the turning point of the entire narrative and perhaps of Jacob's entire life. When the man saw that he did not prevail against him by conventional means, he touched the socket of his hip. This was not a blow of brute force, but a precise, supernatural, and devastating touch. It was an act that demonstrated an infinitely superior power, a power that could have ended the fight at any moment. That touch was an act of mercy disguised as violence. It was the revelation that the celestial being was not fighting to defeat Jacob, but to defeat Jacob's resistance. With a single touch, the source of Jacob's physical strength was disabled. The socket of his hip, the pivot of his power and movement, was put out of joint. In that instant, Jacob was broken. All his strength, all his pride, all his ability to fight or flee was gone. He could no longer stand on his own. The fight, as he knew it, was over. He was physically defeated, incapacitated, vulnerable, and completely at the mercy of his adversary. And it is here, in this moment of total physical inability, that Jacob's true victory begins to manifest. Unable to fight, he does the only thing left for him to do. He clings. The man who once pushed and fought now clings. Desperately, not to bring down, but to not be left behind. His weakness became his greatest weapon. The touch that broke him was the same touch that opened him up to a new way of fighting, the fight of dependence, the tenacity of faith that refuses to let go of the source of its own breaking. The dynamic of the battle shifted from a physical confrontation to an embrace of desperate supplication. The dawn begins to break on the horizon, and the celestial being says, "Let me go, for the day has broken." This is not an admission of defeat, but a final test. It is an invitation for Jacob, now wounded and exhausted, to simply give up and end the ordeal. But Jacob's response, uttered from the depths of his broken soul, has become one of the most powerful declarations of faith in the entire Bible. He says in verse 26, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." In this sentence, Jacob finally recognizes the true identity of his opponent. He understands that he is not fighting against an enemy, but clinging to the only source of blessing that exists. He does not ask to be healed. He does not ask to understand what happened. He asks for the only thing that truly matters, the blessing. Years before, he had stolen a blessing from his father through deception. Now he begs for a true blessing, not with cunning, but with brutal honesty, with a faith that clings in the midst of pain and confusion. He finally understood that the blessing is not in winning with one's own strength, but in surrendering and clinging to the one who has all the power. His greatest physical defeat became the stage for his greatest spiritual victory. Centuries later, the prophet Hosea, in chapter 12, verse 4, would give us a deeper insight into how Jacob prevailed. The text says that he struggled with the angel and overcame. He wept and sought his favor. This revelation is crucial. It adds the dimension of tears and supplication to the struggle. Jacob's victory was not silent and stoic. It was loud. It was wet with tears. It was a desperate cry from a broken heart. He won not by being stronger, but by being more desperate. He prevailed because his surrender was complete, transforming the struggle into an act of broken worship. Jacob's tears that night washed away the dirt of a life of deception. Every sob was a confession, every plea an act of surrender. Hosea teaches us that the way to prevail with God is not through our strength, but through our confessed weakness. It is not by tensing our muscles, but by bending our knees, even if, in Jacob's case, he was doing it while standing, clinging to his divine opponent. The strength that moves the heart of God is not our self-confidence, but our declared dependence, our honesty in admitting that without him we are lost. The celestial being then asks a piercing question in verse 27, "What is your name?" He did not ask because he did not know. He asked so that Jacob would confess. In a universe where names define essence, to speak one's own name was an act of self-revelation, and the answer came, likely with shame and pain. Jacob, I am the deceiver. I am the supplanter. I am the one who has lived by cheating. He had to verbalize his flawed identity, his broken nature, so that he could be freed from it. He had to admit who he was to become who he was destined to be. Only after this confession is the blessing released. In verse 28 comes the declaration that would change history. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. This is not just a change of name, it is a change of identity, of nature, and of destiny, from deceiver to Prince of God. The name that once defined him by his sinful past was replaced by a name that would define him by his divine encounter. His struggle was not forgotten, but was re-signified, becoming the very foundation of his new identity. The blessing he received was a new self. He did not gain riches or power, but a new essence forged in the fire of that confrontation. The proof that he had been with God was not a scar of victory, but a mark of weakness. He walked out of that fight with a limp. The dislocated hip would be a permanent reminder for him and for everyone else that his greatest strength was found in the moment his own strength was broken. His limp was his testimony, God's signature on his life, declaring that he had been touched by the Almighty. And to understand the full power of this transformation, we need to remember who Jacob was. Genesis 27:36 shows us his own brother's perception of him. Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. This was his reputation, his trademark. He was the man of trickery, of manipulation, the master of self-sufficiency. His life was a complex web of schemes and strategies to secure his own blessing and safety. He trusted in his mind and his ability to control situations, a characteristic that put him in constant conflict with the sovereignty of God. This identity of deceiver was the fortress that needed to be torn down that night. Every muscle Jacob used to fight the angel was an echo of his life of self-reliance. He was, in fact, fighting with the same methods he had always used. But against God, cunning is useless, and human strength is like dust. The touch on the hip was the final blow against this fortress of self. God needed to cripple Jacob's natural strength so that he could finally discover the supernatural strength that comes from dependence and faith. The death of the deceiver was the condition for the birth of the prince. And what was the immediate result of this identity change? We see the fruit in Genesis chapter 33, verse 4. After years of fear and anticipation of a violent confrontation with his brother Esau, the meeting finally happens. But instead of a fight, we see grace. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. The transformed Jacob, now Israel, did not approach with a plan or a trick, but with humility, bowing 7 times. His internal transformation disarmed the external hostility. Peace with God at Jabbok produced peace with man on the road. This peaceful encounter with Esau is irrefutable proof that the struggle with the angel was real and effective. The name change was not just an honorary title, it was a soul surgery that altered his behavior, his reactions, and his character. The man, who once created conflict wherever he went, now became an agent of reconciliation. The blessing he received was not just for him, but to flow through him, bringing healing to broken relationships that were a direct result of his old nature. The proof of our spiritual transformation is always seen in the way we relate to others. The biblical narrative, therefore, presents us with a complete and powerful arc. We see a man defined by his cunning, isolated in his anguish, confronted by a divine power, broken in his strength, clinging in his desperate faith, confessing his failed identity, receiving a new name, and finally, living out the practical consequences of that transformation. Each verse is a step on this journey from self to God, from self-confidence to dependence, from manipulation to worship. The Bible shows us, without holding back, that the path to true exaltation invariably passes through the valley of humiliation and surrender. The sacred text does not hide the pain of the process. Jacob left with a limp. The transformation had a cost. The blessing came with a wound. This teaches us that the encounters with God that truly change us will always leave us with a mark, a spiritual limp. It may be the loss of pride, the breaking of a selfish ambition, the abandonment of an addiction. This mark is not a sign of punishment, but a seal of intimacy, a constant reminder that we have been with God face to face and have survived, not by our strength, but by His grace. The biblical exposition invites us to see our own struggles in this light. The texts of Genesis and Hosea are not just about Jacob, they are about us. They give us permission to wrestle with God, to be honest in our pain and our questions. But they also show us the path to victory. Tears, supplication, the desperate clinging to the one who confronts us. The Word assures us that if we have the courage to confess our name, to admit our weakness, He is ready to give us a new one, to call us princes and princesses destined to reign with Him. Thus, armed with the clarity of the Word, we can now deepen our understanding of the central conflict. It was not just a physical fight, but a war of wills, a cosmic drama being played out in a small valley. The conflict was not between the angel and Jacob, but between two kingdoms, two philosophies, two ways of living, the self-sufficiency of man and the absolute sovereignty of God. And it is in this tension that the true nature of the drama is revealed in all its glory and transformative power. The true conflict of that night was not fought in the dust of a valley between the muscles of a man and the form of an angel. That was only the visible arena. The real battle, the war that made heaven hold its breath, took place in the invisible territory of Jacob's will. It was not a confrontation between a creature and a celestial being, but a titanic clash between two philosophies of life, two kingdoms vying for the throne of a single soul. On one side, the stubborn and resourceful self-sufficiency of man. On the other, the inescapable and loving sovereignty of God. Every move on the physical battlefield was merely an echo of this much deeper spiritual war, a struggle for the control of Jacob's very being. For years, Jacob was the architect of his own universe, the master builder of his own fortune. His philosophy was simple: trust in the strength of his arm and the agility of his mind. He had built a fortress of self-confidence. Brick by brick, with every successful deception, every shrewd negotiation, every meticulously executed plan. He was a king in his own kingdom, a sovereign of his own circumstances. Jacob did not wait for a blessing. He took it. He did not ask. He schemed. His entire life was a testament to the power of self, a declaration that a man can, through his own strength, forge his own destiny and secure his own success. But on that night, he came face to face with a totally different reality, a power that did not operate by the rules of his world. He faced the sovereignty of God, a force that cannot be manipulated, deceived, or overpowered. It was an absolute power, unimpressed by Jacob's wealth, unintimidated by his physical strength, and not to be diverted by his cunning. For the first time in his life, Jacob met an opponent against whom none of his weapons worked. The fortress of self, which had seemed so impregnable, began to tremble on its foundations before a power that was, in its essence, wholly other. The physical struggle then became the perfect metaphor for this internal conflict. Every muscle Jacob tensed was his ego screaming for control. Every time he tried a new technique to bring down his adversary, it was his old nature as a deceiver trying to find a loophole, a shortcut to victory. He was fighting in the only way he knew how, applying the strategies of a lifetime to a problem that was not earthly, but divine. The resistance he offered the angel was, in fact, the resistance of his own soul to bowing before its creator, a stubborn refusal to admit that there was a power greater than his own. The cosmic tension that permeated the valley of Jabbok could be summarized in a single, piercing question. Will the deceiver finally surrender to become a prince of God? Would he continue to be the man who grabs heels to supplant, or would he become the man who clings to God to be saved? The entire night was a long and painful process of stripping away, where every layer of pride and self-confidence was forcibly torn off. The universe watched to see if the identity forged by man would give way to the identity decreed by God. The destiny of a holy lineage hung on this single decision of the will. Imagine the agony in this battle of wills. On one hand, the angel, representing the will of God, was firm, constant, and tireless. His strength did not diminish. His determination did not waver. He was the personification of divine purpose, a purpose that seeks to set us free, even if the process feels like an assault. On the other hand, Jacob, representing the human will, was frantic, desperate, and ultimately limited. His strength had an end. His energy was draining away. The struggle exposed the fundamental truth. The human will, when pitted against the divine will, may fight for a time. It may resist stubbornly, but in the end, it will find its limit. In this arena, Jacob's self was fighting for its own survival. The throne in his heart, so long occupied by his own ambitions and plans, was being besieged by its rightful king. Every moment of that struggle was an invitation to abdicate, a call to surrender. But the self does not give up its reign easily. It clings to power, fights against deposition, whispers in our ears that to surrender is the same as to be annihilated. Jacob's struggle is our struggle, the daily battle we fight against total surrender, the fear of letting go of the reins and trusting that the sovereign of the universe truly knows what is best for us. The conflict was, in essence, the collision between creation and the Creator. Jacob, the creature, was trying to impose his agenda on reality. The angel, representing the Creator, was there to realign the creature with the purpose for which it was made. It was the hand of the potter on the wheel, meeting resistance in the stubborn clay. The clay, in its ignorance, believes that the process of being pressed and molded is an act of destruction, not realizing that it is the only way to become a vessel of honor. Jacob's pain was the pain of the clay resisting transformation, the agony of an old identity being pulverized to make way for a new one. The night deepened, and with it, Jacob's desperation. He realized that his adversary was no ordinary man. His strength was not natural. He was not facing an enemy that could be tired out or overcome by strategy. He was fighting against the very fabric of reality, against a force that was the source of all strength. The dramatic tension reached its peak as the realization began to dawn in his exhausted mind. He was not fighting to survive an attack, but to survive an encounter with holiness, with the pure, irreducible power of the divine. This is the essence of the dramatic conflict we all face in our personal Jabbok. God loves us too much to leave us as Jacob. He longs to call us Israel. And to do that, he must confront us. He must meet us in our area of greatest strength and self-confidence and show us that it is insufficient. He challenges our intellect, our control over our career, our reliance on our health or our relationships. He presses on the very place where we are most proud, because that is where the fortress of our self has its central command. The struggle, therefore, was the physical representation of the death of the ego. For the divine identity to be born, the human, self-built, and self-sufficient identity had to die. There could be no peaceful coexistence between Jacob and Israel in the same soul. One had to give way to the other. The night of Jabbok was the funeral of Jacob's self-sufficiency. It was a long and painful ceremony where he was forced to watch his own strength be drained, his own cunning prove useless, until all that remained was an empty, broken man, ready to be filled by something new. The spiritual contrast was absolute, the strength of man against the strength of God, the wisdom of man against the purpose of God, the time of man against the eternity of God. It was the antithesis between self-acquired glory, which is fleeting and fragile, and the glory received by grace, which is eternal and unshakable. Jacob was being forced to choose which spring he would drink from for the rest of his life, the murky spring of his own resources or the crystal-clear spring of divine provision. The struggle was the means by which God made him thirsty for living water. The tension also lay in the paradox of divine love. How can a loving God engage in such a violent conflict with his chosen one? The answer lies at the heart of the gospel itself. True love is not complacent, it is transformative. God's love for Jacob was so intense that he refused to leave him in his state of deception and limitation. Divine love was willing to wound the body to save the soul, to cause temporary pain, to grant an eternal identity. The conflict was not a sign of the absence of love, but the proof of its fierce and redemptive presence. This battle of wills is the heart of the entire spiritual journey. The question that echoed at Jabbok is the same one that echoes in our lives. Who will be on the throne, us or God? Will we continue to fight to build our own kingdom with our own strength, or will we surrender to become citizens and heirs of his kingdom? This is not a one-time decision, but a daily struggle, a constant choice to die to ourself so that Christ can live through us, transforming our deceiver nature into our prince inheritance. The night was drawing to a close. Jacob's energy was completely depleted. He had fought with everything he had and failed. He was at the absolute limit of his ability, at the point of total rupture. The conflict had pushed him to his extreme, to the place where stubbornness finally begins to yield under the weight of exhaustion. The great question remained. Now that his strength was gone, what would he do? Would he curse the darkness and give up? Or would he find a new way to fight, a new source of strength in the midst of his total weakness? The stage was set for the decisive moment. Human resistance had been brought to its breaking point. Self-sufficiency had been proven to be an illusion. The dramatic conflict had fulfilled its purpose, to empty Jacob of himself, to prepare him for the revelation that was to come. The stalemate had to be broken, not by Jacob's strength, but by a sovereign act that would change the rules of the confrontation forever and reveal the true mission of that mysterious angel. The tension was at its peak, awaiting the touch that would change everything. The night was reaching its limit. The air, once thick with the tension of the fight, was now thin with exhaustion. The darkness began to yield, threatened on the horizon by a thread of grey light, the first whisper of dawn. In the center of the valley, two beings were locked in a stalemate that was more than physical. It was a stalemate of wills, a moment suspended in a time. Jacob's strength, once a well of vigor, was now just a vapor, a last ember of resistance. He no longer fought to win, but out of pure instinct, out of a stubbornness that was the essence of his being. The universe watched, for it knew that the breaking point had come, and something was about to give way forever. And then the move came, but not from Jacob. It came from the one who, for hours, had seemed only to react, contain, and resist. The celestial being, whose strength was as vast as the ocean, made a move that was not one of attack, but of revelation. It was a deliberate act, the execution of a divine plan laid out since eternity. He did not use a crushing blow to end the fight, for the mission was never to annihilate the man. The mission was to rebaptize him. And the baptism at that moment would come not through water, but through a touch of fire, a precise contact that would expose the fundamental truth of Jacob's existence and, by extension, our own. In an instant, that, stretched for an eternity, the sacred text tells us that the angel, seeing that he did not prevail against him, performed the decisive act. He reached out his hand and did not strike Jacob's chest or head. He touched the socket of his hip, the very point from which his strength, his balance, and his power to stand emanated. It was not a human touch. In it was the weight of creation, the energy of a star, the power that holds galaxies together. It was a surgical, precise, and final touch, a supernatural contact that aimed not to wound the surface, but to dismantle the very structure of Jacob's human strength. In that moment, everything changed. A shockwave ran through Jacob's body, a piercing pain followed by an overwhelming weakness. The pivot of his strength was dislocated. The man who had stood firm against a heavenly power for an entire night collapsed in on himself. His ability to fight, to resist, and even to stand was taken from him in the blink of an eye. The fortress of his self-confidence, built over a lifetime, was demolished by a single touch. There in the dust, with his hip displaced and his body trembling with pain and helplessness, The Jacob who trusted in his own arm died. And in this death, the revelation exploded with the intensity of the rising sun. This is the ultimate truth, the climax of the entire narrative. The angel's mission was never to be defeated. The mission was to bring Jacob to his absolute limit, to the 0 point of his own ability. The celestial being was not testing Jacob's strength to see if he would win. He was exhausting Jacob's strength so that he could finally discover where true power resided. The fight was not a test of muscles, but a stripping of the soul. The divine hand oppressed him not to crush him, but to empty him of himself and create a space for glory. With his body broken and his strength gone, Jacob's war changed its nature. He could no longer push, he could no longer fight to break free. The only action left to him was to cling. His arms, once instruments of combat, became anchors of faith. He clung to his divine adversary, no longer with a spirit of defiance, but with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to his rescuer. His weakness became his new strength. The touch that broke him was the same one that forced him to surrender, and in his surrender he found a new and invincible way to fight. It is in this state of total dependence that the angel tests him one last time. Let me go, for the day is breaking. But from the depths of his broken soul, Jacob utters the words that would seal his destiny and define true victory. I will not let you go unless you bless me. What an extraordinary declaration. He does not ask for healing. He does not curse his attacker. He recognizes the identity of the one who broke him. He finally understands that the hand that wounds is also the only hand that can bless. His plea is not a negotiation, but the cry of a heart that knows it cannot survive without the touch of the one he fought. Herein lies the divine paradox of victory. The Bible says that Jacob prevailed. But how? He did not prevail by throwing the angel to the ground. He prevailed by refusing to let him go. His victory was not in conquering his opponent, but in conquering his own pride. He won at the very moment he lost all his strength. He triumphed when his only strategy became the desperate embrace of faith. Jacob's greatest achievement was not an act of power, but an act of absolute dependence. He teaches us that with God, we do not win by fighting against him, but by clinging to him with everything we have left. The valley of Jabbok, which had been an arena of combat, was transformed into a sacred altar. The angel's touch was the fire of the sacrifice, and what was placed on the altar was Jacob's ego, his self-sufficiency, his identity as the deceiver. Every drop of sweat, every tear of pain, became part of the offering. In that moment of brokenness and surrender, a flawed man offered his weakness to God and in return received a divine identity. The struggle was not a punishment, but a consecration, the moment when an ordinary man was set apart for an extraordinary purpose through a permanent mark of his weakness. The blessing Jacob now sought was infinitely greater than the one he had stolen from his father years before. That was a blessing of earthly prosperity, obtained by deceit. This was a blessing of heavenly identity, won through surrender. He was no longer fighting for more sheep or riches. He was fighting for his very soul, for a new name that would erase his past and define his future. He was fighting to become the man God had created him to be, not the man he had made of himself. It was a thirst not for things, but for transformation. Has this revelation touched your heart? Can you see that the most intense struggle of your life might actually be a divine encounter in disguise? Perhaps the touch that caused your pain, that made you limp, is the prelude to your greatest blessing. If this truth resonates with you, share this video with someone who is in their own dark night, with someone who desperately needs to know that the hand pressing them might be the same hand that is about to give them a new name and a new beginning. Be a carrier of this hope. The first ray of sun finally broke through the darkness, bathing the valley in a golden light. The light did not reveal a winner and a loser in the human sense. It revealed a transformed man. Jacob was broken, limping, and would remain so for the rest of his life. But he was also blessed, rebaptized. He called that place Peniel, the face of God, for he declared, "I have seen God face to face, and my life has been delivered." The climax is not the pain of the touch, but the glory of survival and the grace of the transformation that follows. The fight was over, but the journey of Israel was just beginning. Jacob's story ceases to be an ancient scroll and becomes a mirror for our soul. The dust of that distant valley settles on our own struggles, and the echo of that confrontation reverberates in our darkest nights. How many times have we found ourselves at our own Jabbok, wrestling desperately in the dark? We fight against a circumstance that won't yield, against an anguish that won't dissipate, against a divine silence that seems deafening. And in our agony, the question we ask is the same as Jacob's. Are we fighting an enemy who has come to destroy us? The narrative of Peniel offers us a revolutionary answer. Perhaps we are fighting a God who loves us too much to leave us as we are, a God determined to bless us, even if it means he must first break us. We too fight with Jacob's weapons. We use the strength of our intellect to plan a way out, the tenacity of our will to control the outcome, the cunning of our strategies to ensure our security. We trust in our career as our source of identity, in our health as our pillar of strength, in our relationships as our refuge. And it is precisely there, in our greatest area of self-confidence, that the divine touch often occurs. It is the business that fails, the unexpected diagnosis, the betrayal that paralyzes us. It is the moment when God, in his severe mercy, dislocates the joint of our self-sufficiency, forcing us to our knees because we can no longer stand on our own. That touch that makes us limp becomes the indelible mark of our encounter with the sacred. From that day forward, we walk differently. Our limp is the proof that we have been with God face to face and have survived. It is the constant reminder that our strength is not our own, but his. The world may see our weakness, our wound, our limitation as a defeat, but in the eyes of faith, our limp is our pulpit. It is the platform from which we can proclaim the strength of him who is made perfect in our weakness. Our area of greatest pain becomes the source of our greatest spiritual authority, for it is there that the glory of God rests on us most visibly. Therefore, do not despise your struggle. Do not curse the hand that pressures you. The angel's secret mission was not to test Jacob's strength, but to exhaust it completely, so that he could finally discover the true source of power, total dependence on God. The final revelation for us is this: God does not fear our struggle, he instigates it. He meets us in our darkest night not to punish us, but to rebaptize us. The mark he leaves may cause us to limp for the rest of our lives, but it is this weakness that will qualify us to carry the weight of his glory and to walk in a new name and a new destiny. The dawn broke at Peniel, and Jacob walked away limping but blessed, transformed from a deceiver into a prince of God. Today, the Son of Righteousness desires to rise in the midst of the darkness of our lives. The same grace that met Jacob in the valley is available to us now. The question is not whether God has the power to transform our struggle, but whether we will have the courage to stop fighting against him and start clinging to him. Will we have the audacity, in the midst of our pain and confusion, to refuse to let him go until he blesses us? Until he speaks a new identity over us? This is the final invitation to you. Stop running from your Jabbok. Stop postponing the encounter with the one who is waiting for you in the place of your greatest anguish. Embrace the struggle. Surrender your strength. Understand That the pressure you feel is not for your destruction, but for your consecration. God is inviting you to a divine dance, where He will lead you to the end of yourself so that you can find the beginning of Him. It is in the arena of surrender that today's deceivers become the princes and princesses of God, heirs of a promise that cannot be shaken. Allow Him to break you so He can remake you. Let Him empty you of your own ambitions to fill you with His purpose. Your victory will not be found in your ability to overcome the trial, but in your willingness to cling to the presence in the midst of it. Your prayer can change from "get me out of here" to "reveal yourself to me here." The greatest blessing is not the removal of the struggle, but the transformation that occurs within it. It is the change of name, the certainty of having been with God and having been permanently marked by His love. Do not be deceived. Surrender is not weakness, it is the act of greatest spiritual courage. It is the conscious choice to trust that the potter knows what he is doing, even when the pressure on his wheel seems unbearable. It is the faith that dares to believe that behind the face of an adversary is the face of a father, and that his touch, though painful, is always guided by a redemptive love. Your future, the future of your family, your eternal destiny may be being sealed in this dark night you are passing through. Right now, wherever you are, identify your struggle. Give your Jabbok a name. Is it a battle in your mind, in your home, in your health, in your faith? Present it to God. Stop using your own strength and start clinging to Him with a desperate faith. Tell Him from the bottom of your heart, "I will not let you go unless you bless me. I will not leave this valley the same way I came in. Change my name, change my story." If you believe that God has the power to transform your most intense struggle into your greatest blessing, if you are ready to exchange your strength for His and receive a new identity, I want you to do something prophetic. Write in the comments right now, "I am Israel." Declare by faith that you are no longer defined by your past of deception or your present struggle, but by your inheritance as a prince or princess who has struggled with God and prevailed through surrender. As you write, read the other comments. Each "I am Israel" represents a soul in their own night of Jabbok, seeking the face of God. Pray for one person whose comment you will read. Let's turn this comment section into an altar of intercession, a community of warriors who limp but who walk under an open heaven, carrying the marks of their encounter with the King. Remember, we are stronger together as a nation of princes and princesses. The journey from deception to royalty, from Jacob to Israel, is the journey of each one of us. We were not called to an easy life, but to a transformed life. We were called to struggle, to cling, and to be marked by the glory of God. May your limp be a powerful testimony, and may your new name echo in eternity for the honor and glory of the one who meets us in the darkness to bring us into His marvelous light. Your struggle is not the end, it is your Peniel. It is the place where you will see the face of God and have your life saved.